And so let's go ahead and let's read verses 1 through 7 of Genesis chapter 9. 1 through 7. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat the flesh with its life that is its blood. And for your life blood I will require reckoning. From every beast I require it, and from every man. From his fellow man I require reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed. For God made man in his own image. And you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly upon the earth, and multiply in it. And so here in verses 1 through 7, we see that God says the fear and the dread of all moving things will be upon mankind. And so here the question is, were animals not afraid of humans pre-fall? Now the text doesn't explicitly say what this means. Now if we look at Genesis chapter 1 verse 30, we see that God was given all the plants of the earth to eat. And so one of the questions is before the fall, was there this understand reality between animals and human beings, that humans weren't going to eat the animals, and therefore the animals were not afraid of humans. But after the flood, we see here that now that God puts the fear and dread into animals, and so they have this innate fear of human beings. Some have suggested maybe this existed before the flood, that maybe God suspended this type of innate reality between man and beast in the ark. Because as you can see, if you're going to be in an enclosed structure for a year with these animals, it's kind of important for you to be kind of on the same wavelength. And so we don't know exactly for sure, but it seems like it may have been something that existed before the fall. Is this going to be now because animals are now for food? Is there a deeper reason for this? Is man now have the ability to eat animals where he didn't have that before the flood, and so now God has given the animals this type of safety gap, if you will, of having this innate, fear and flight when it comes to humankind, to kind of give them some safety when it comes there. We don't really know for sure, but we just know that it says that the fear and dread would be given to man, which really leads us to our second question is, are animals going to be able to be given for food now? Well, obviously they are. And this probably contrasts with Genesis chapter 1, verse 30. And so before the flood, there is no explicit command or explicit statement by God saying that man can eat animals. Now we do know that God made animal skins for Adam and Eve to wear. So we do know that animals, of course, were sacrificed both by God for mankind, but also in Genesis chapter 3, we also see in Genesis chapter 4, we see that Abel sacrifices a lamb for God in Genesis chapter 4. So obviously man was already domesticating animals. We're told that Abel was a keeper, was a herdsman, a keeper of the sheep. And so we see here that man was already keeping animals, but in the ancient Near Eastern world, animals weren't kept primarily for food, right? I mean, when we think about keeping animals today, most of us, at least from my personal background, I think about cows. Well, the number one reason we keep cows is for food, so we can eat them, right? We can have chickens. What's the one reason we have chickens? It's not because they're cute, right? Don't tell Sam Johnson that, but they're not very cute, so we keep them so we can eat them, right? Take their eggs or whatever. But in the ancient Eastern world, these animals they kept most of the time was for their milk, was for their wool, and for other domestic properties, and eating them was just kind of a side benefit. Food with meat was very rare in the ancient Near East. Even today is pretty rare. And so it does come with some of the restrictions, however. One of those restrictions is the animal is living, so you can't find a dead carcass and eat it, and so no roadkill. And also it must not have its lifeblood. The animal has to have been killed before you can start feasting on the animal. And so some barbaric practices in the ancient world would actually try to keep the animal alive as long as possible while you were harvesting it, because obviously there's no refrigeration, and so you could try to harvest parts of the animal while still trying to keep it alive. And so God says that's a no-no. And so then we have the life of man. And so man's life is sacred because we are made in the image of God. One of the things we talked about a few weeks ago was a distinction between man and animal, and how we have been given the seal, the breath of life we've been given. We're different. We have God's Spirit within us. We're made in His image. And so God says now that whenever someone commits murder against someone who is a man, his lifeblood is going to be required. And God hands this responsibility over to society. And He says, I'm going to require that you take justice and judgment on this. I'm not going to strike somebody down dead for murdering somebody. I'm leaving that in the hands of you to execute that justice from a societal level. Now, one of the most controversial things today, both in our country politically, but also in Christianity, is whether or not capital punishment should be executed today. There are many people on both sides of the aisle politically, but also in the church who have very strong feelings one way or the other about whether or not we should have capital punishment in this country, whether or not something like that is Christian or not. How can we be loving, forgiving, turning the other cheek, but also at the same time demanding that someone have capital punishment? Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but in a crowd this size, there are probably those in here who are on both sides of the fence, which is fine. Some of the arguments, I think, are important for us to talk about when it comes to Genesis chapter 9. Some people would say, well, if we kill them, that's not showing the forgiveness that God causes us to have. Well, we're called to have forgiveness as God in Christ has forgiven us. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32. And so our standard of forgiveness and justice comes from God. And yet God is the one who says that capital punishment here, that He's going to require the lifeblood of mankind. Also, some would say, well, yeah, but the old law was abolished. Colossians 2:14. Well, this is given before the old law was given at Sinai in the book of Exodus. And so this predates or supersedes the Mosaical law. Some would say, well, if we kill them, then they can't come to repentance and that we're sending them to hell. Well, at the same time, when God issues this capital punishment here in Genesis chapter 9, it still ends their life and sends them to their Maker, and also nixes their opportunity for repentance if they don't take the repentance before the capital punishment is executed. And so I tend to be on the side where capital punishment is a good thing that is ordained by God, and also reinstituted in Romans chapter 13, verse 4, when Paul says the government does not bear the sword in vain. Going along with this says in here in Genesis 9 about how society has been given the charge to execute justice, and a part of that is with capital punishment. With that being said, there are cases of those who have been probably condemned wrongly and who have probably been killed because of something they didn't do. I mean, we all know the famous film and book To Kill a Mockingbird, right? That was made famous by a movie with, was it Henry Ford later? Was that Henry Ford? Fonda? John Fonda? Who's that? Gregory Peck. Wow. I was not even in the realm of Atticus Finch. At least I know the fictional character's name. So but at the same time, I am happy with where we are as a society and the fact that there's been many people who've been exonerated because of technological advances that we have. And so, but it is an interesting discussion about Christianity today and the idea of capital punishment. And so does anybody have anything they want to question or comment that you would like to give on any of these three things? The animals, capital punishment, not eating before food?
What does it mean in verse 5 when it says, surely I will require your lifeblood from every beast I will require it.
Yeah.
Every man, So is that saying that if an animal kills a man, God's going to kill the animal? Or is that saying if an animal kills another animal, then that animal should be punished?
Well, I think you see this played out when it comes to the law of Moses. And if an animal like gores a man to death, then that animal is supposed to be killed. And so the idea of even if the animal, of course, an animal doesn't have a soul, it doesn't make conscious decisions, but even if he violates the image of God by killing a man, then his life is to be required in the Mosaical law. And so I think that is exactly what it's saying. I mean, there's a town in Tennessee that's famous, and I forget what town it is, and somebody here may know. There's a town in Tennessee that's famous for killing an animal because it killed its trainer. Remember the animal I'm talking about is? An elephant, that's right. And I forgot what town it was, Tennessee. Was it Hohenwald? Don't they have like an elephant sanctuary now? Well, that's kind of like, everything comes full circle, right? And but Hohenwald, okay. And so, hung an elephant with a crane because it killed his trainer. So interesting tidbit of history. I have. Maybe the law said if you kill somebody in Tennessee, you die by hanging, and they just thought, you know what, let's just have some fun with this and see what we can do. I don't know. Fun was probably the wrong word. But you can actually Google it. There are actually pictures of the elephant being hung.
SeaWorld is going to do that to Shampoo down there.
Yeah. And so it is interesting. That's for certain. Some vegetarians have looked at this passage and said, look, we weren't allowed to eat meat pre-flood. And so that was their key to their living long. And so to be a good Christian, a good Bible follower, you can't eat meat and animals because that's a symptom of our fallen state. Why is this a bad argument? Well, they would say here God allowed them to. But you're on to something, though. In the old law, some of the sacrifices, like Passover, they had to sacrifice the lamb. And what do they have to do with the lamb? You can eat it. You had to eat the lamb and leave nothing left. And so in that case, in the old law, God actually commands people to eat meat. And so, my fellow meat eaters, that's for you. Okay? All right. And so, verses 8 through 17, we won't read all the passages tonight, but we will for a while at least time is still going pretty good for us. And so let's read verses 8 through 17. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you. As many came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I have made between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I've set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it, remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all the flesh on the earth. And God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. The word covenant is used there lots of times because covenant is a major theme in the book of Genesis. What God is trying to do through the inspired penmanship of Moses, right, is not to give everybody, I'm the same way. I'm like, there's so many questions unanswered in Genesis, especially 1 through 11, that I wish we were told. But the thing is, that's not what God is trying to do. He's not trying to give us an exhaustive history of what life was like before the flood or before the time when all the languages of man were discombobulated. I don't know. But what he's trying to show us is how Israel came to be, how the covenant came to be given to them, and what's their relationship with God and His covenants. And so the main covenant we're going to talk about is in Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis 15 and 17, where God talks about the covenant He's going to give with Abraham to bless all nations. But here we're introduced to the idea of this covenant with Noah after the flood. And so a covenant is this agreement made between it's called a suzerain covenant, between someone of a higher status and elevation. Of course, this would be God, to someone of lower status. And this would, of course, would be man. And so one of the questions we have is, had it not rained before, was this the first rainbow? Anybody want to guess? Who says yes? Who says no? Raise your hand if you say yes. Who thinks first rainbow? Raise your hand if you say no. Raise your hand if you're undecided. Okay, I'll raise my hand with the undecided. I'm not sure, right? Because the Bible tells us that in the garden a mist came up and it watered the ground. Now, we think maybe, potentially, that when it rained with the flood, it may have been the first time it had ever rained. We don't know for sure, but we think that might be the case. Now, if it doesn't rain, there's no precipitation in the air, then there's not really a rainbow, because you kind of need that with the light and the prism to, make a rainbow. So this may have been the first rainbow. Maybe it wasn't the first rainbow. But the idea here is not the fact that the rainbow was the first time it existed or not, but the idea is that a significance was tied to the rainbow. You can go to, Peyton and Ashton got engaged recently. You can go to a jewelry store and there's all types of wedding bands, right? There's all types of rings. There's all types of metal in round shape. It means nothing, right? It's a cold metallic thing. George Jones, Tammy Wynette, right? There you go. It's a cold metallic thing. But when a man gets down on one knee and gives it to a woman, that cold metallic thing takes on a whole different meaning. It's not that it came into existence at the time he handed it to the woman, but the idea that something significant at that point was tied to that metallic object, that symbol of everlasting love, that undying love in nature. And that's what we have here, this symbol of God's never-ending covenant that he's not going to destroy the earth again when it comes to the flood or to the waters of the flood. Brother James?
The way it's worded, they knew what he was talking about. It said, rainbow. And what's that?
Yeah.
It sounded like they knew what it was.
Yeah.
And this came up from the ground, but somebody down went higher enough to make a little rainbow.
Potentially. It's a good question. It's a great question, and honestly, we just don't know the answer to it. I think that perhaps it maybe wasn't the first rainbow, but if it was the first rainbow, I'm cool with that. I mean, either way, I'm fine with what it is. The importance, though, is the significance that is tied to the rainbow. But it's a very interesting discussion. There's the idea of covenants is very important, but one of the things that's interesting is there are similarities in ancient and recent literature about the rainbow. In fact, there's a relic that we have from the 11th century. It's an Assyrian depiction showing two hands reaching out of the clouds. And one hand, there is a blessing. So it's like food and stuff like that from the gods. And then next, it is a bow. Now it's interesting because here in Genesis 9, 1 through 17, God has given man two things. What has he given him? Food, the ability to kill animals and eat them, right? And a rainbow. And so here you have this painting from 1,000 years before Christ of two hands coming out of the sky in Assyria, and it's got food and a bow. And so, pretty neat, right? I think it's pretty neat. And so, common ancestry. And so here we have the fall part 2. And so let's look at verses 18 through 23. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. And these three were the sons of Noah, and from these three the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soul, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and the two of his brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took the garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered their nakedness of their father, and they did not see their father's nakedness. Now let's just go ahead and finish the entire chapter. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew that the youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. And so here we have the fall part 2. Now what's interesting here is that Noah plants a vineyard. He works the soil. Now this word for soul was the same soul that man is made from in Genesis 3:17. That's the same one that people are doomed to die and return to in Genesis 3:19. It's the same soul that is doomed in the flood, and also the one that God promises not to destroy again. And so here Noah starts to plant a vineyard, and he harvests the vineyard and becomes drunk, and he falls asleep or passes out or whatever it is. We don't know exactly what takes place, but we do know that what Ham did was not good. But we're not exactly sure what he did. But when Abraham woke up, he was extremely upset. Now, the key here is saw and told, and what those two verbs mean, especially in this context of Genesis chapter 9. And there have been all kinds of things that have been proposed as to what Ham did. Some have suggested that Ham sexually molested his father. There are some that suggest that Ham, there's some crazy ideas of what takes place here in Genesis chapter 9. One of the ones that is possible is the idea that Ham uncovered his father's nakedness by laying with his mother and committing an incestuous act, or at least thinking about doing that and then telling his brothers. We're not exactly sure what takes place, but it seems contextually odd that if all he did was to see and tell his brothers about his father's nakedness, that it would warrant such a harsh curse from his father. And so Leviticus chapter 20, verses 11, points to the idea that a sexual relationship with one's mother or stepmother can be described as uncovering the nakedness of the father. And so there's also some similarities between Leviticus chapter 9 and in Genesis chapter 9 and also in Genesis 19. And so some have said perhaps maybe when the idea that Abraham harvesting the wine, getting drunk, perhaps Miss Noah also was with him and also was inebriated and passed out in the tent. And when you look at Genesis chapter 9 and Genesis 19, there are a lot of similarities there that are interesting. They're the only people on earth. In Genesis 9, this is true. In Genesis 19, it's not true, but Lot and his daughters think they're the only people left on earth. They're worried about reproduction. God has just twice in this narrative between verses 1 through 17 told about how they're supposed to go and reproduce, and they're worried about that. Their father becomes drunk, and it causes the offspring, the children, to violate sexual boundaries. And then even take it a step further, when you look at the importance of the offspring of Genesis 9 and 19, both are the same. Why are we told the story of Lot in Genesis 19? It's not just to show the sinfulness of Lot or his daughters. It's to actually describe how their offspring become nations who are the neighbors of Israel and the land they're fixing to go into. It's telling us where these people came from. Now, when we see here in Genesis chapter 9, the reason we're told this story is not to tell us about Noah's sin or about Ham's sin. Why are we told this story? Canaanites, right. Why are the Canaanites evil and why should we kill them? Why should we wipe them off the face of the earth? And so this entire story is pointing to the offspring, Canaan, why they're cursed. And so the same thing while we get to Genesis 19 and talking about the descendants of Lot and the nations that come from them, which are going to be on Israel's western border. Eastern border. And so there is an idea here that perhaps Ham was wanting to or did sexually violate his mom or his stepmom, whatever, his mother. And this would have been, according to Leviticus 18:20, uncovering his father's nakedness, and this may have been what happened. It's hard to know exactly what happened because contextually the text just doesn't tell us what took place. And like I said, all this is conjecture. We're not really sure. We're trying to piecemeal Genesis 9, Genesis 19, Leviticus 18 through 20, and try to figure out what this uncovered their father's nakedness meant to the audience that received the text of Genesis, because evidently they would have known what it meant. And the closest that we can get to is Leviticus 18 through 20, which is written at the same time by the same guy and received by the same audience. And so there's probably some overlap that we can get from that. Yes, Steve.
We believe we should be quiet where the Bible's quiet. It seems like that's reading an awful lot into a simple statement.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about the audience, they were being impressed upon how extremely important ritual purity and, all that other stuff that doesn't make much sense to us was. I think it's a dangerous road to go down to make such a bizarre speculation that he wanted to suddenly turn into a homosexual raper of his father or whatever.
Yeah.
That's to me, is kind of weird. And he's got a son at this point, Canaan.
Right.
Already, so it's been some time since the flood, probably. Another thing I was wondering, does it say in here that God okayed this pronouncement that Noah made? Does Noah have the right to curse future generations on behalf of God? Or, racist Christians in times past use this to say that black people were superior to black people because that blacks were wanted by God to be in slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Use that because Ham is thought to be the father of black races. I'm smart about that because nowhere says God pronounced this curse. Noah.
Yeah. No, I agree with all your points. The first point is the idea of not speaking where the Bible speaks, which is why I said all this is conjecture. I said the text is too vague to make any definitive claims about this is what is going on. There are some shreds of evidence there that might point to what took place. Like I said, we don't know for sure. The second one is the idea of Noah giving a pronouncement and whether or not God did he have the right to do such? Which is interesting because not only does that qualify for Noah, but also all the patriarchs. Whenever you see Noah give his blessing to his sons and what that's supposed to be, but you also ask about, Abraham and the blessing he gives to Isaac, the idea of Isaac's blessing to Jacob over Esau, and even Jacob to his own sons, the 12 sons, and then giving Manasseh and the sons Ephraim and Manasseh, a double portion basically of Joseph. And so this idea that you see, are they able to speak in terms of God? It's a good question because a lot of times we're not told that these things are inspired utterances, and we're not sure if they are or not, but it seems like with the story of Genesis and Exodus, it seems that the blessings and curses do play an important role in the way it all plays out, I guess you will, when looking at the patriarchal blessings as it happens. Now, the question of, did Noah have the right to say this, or was he inspired when he said it? I don't know, but it does seem to come to pass that the Canaanites are driven from their homeland, and when they take although not as successfully as it should have been. And the third point that you were saying about the way that people would often use this to try to justify slavery, that idea has died out, but it was very prevalent one time and probably still held by some individuals today. One of the interesting things is they would point to this in the curse of Ham, but they wouldn't go to the Mosaical law that said that if you enslaved a man by entrapment, or if a man was born into slavery, that was against the law and punishable. And so American slavery is actually anti-Mosaical law. And so you had Christians that were trying to justify slavery by the Bible. But if you read the terms and conditions of slavery under the Mosaical law, it was expressly condemned. And so, good point.
Grandiose punishment of millions upon millions of people who live in the future by one hungover man waking up from being drunk and naked in his tent.
Yeah. It's true. I agree with you there. But I think that's why the story is told, is the connection. I think that's why it's told, is for the Canaan. I mean, that's why Canaan is mentioned in the cursing, and no other grandchild is mentioned by Noah as a blessing or a cursing. It's his sons, and then just Canaan. Also, like we get into Genesis chapter 10, where there's more attention given to Ham and Canaan and his descendants, because those are going to be the players, if you will, when they get into the land of Canaan. And so, but I agree with all your points. I do. Yes, Brother Charles.
Well, you've already mentioned about slavery, but I used to teach some African Americans. They said that this story about Canaan, they became slaves, and out of history became African Americans.
Yeah. Like I was telling Steve, I think it was very bad hermeneutics that tried to justify American slavery. Is basically what it was. I don't think that.
Even back then they had.
Yeah, and so good comments. Anyone else have a comment or a question? All right. Here is a list, and sorry if you can't see that. I know I try to fit it all on one slide, but I think it's very interesting when you see the parallels between Genesis 1 and 3 versus Genesis 6 and 9. And so there's some interesting things that take place and how they correspond to each other. We talked a little bit last week about it was almost kind of like the flood was almost like a mini Genesis 1 with the chaos and the earth being covered in waters. Then the Spirit of God, or the breath of God, moving the waters, both in Genesis chapter 1 and also in Genesis chapters 7 and 8. And so here you kind of have this non-functional cosmos in Genesis 1-2, but you also had that in Genesis 7:14-24. You also have the cosmos being made functional. And so this idea of God creating a functioning world out of chaos. Then you have the blessing, which is non-functional, and then you also have a blessing made more functional, where God gets more specific in his blessings and makes it more detailed about what it means to man. And then you have a plant connected with the fall. Now, of course, in Genesis 2:9, the plant is the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Well, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 20, it is the vine, right? It's the vineyard. And then you have naked and unaware. Well, of course, we know that Adam and Eve, they were both naked and unaware. They didn't realize this until their eyes were opened. Well, you had the same thing with Noah here in verse 21. Then you have the offense being related to the blessing boundaries. In Genesis 3, 1 through 6, the blessing of the boundaries of when it comes to eating. And then 9, 22 to 23, if we're going with the narrative, as I said, mentioned earlier, which I said was just speculation and conjecture, would be in the reproduction. Then you have the eyes were opened and they knew what they had done. All right, Genesis 3:7, also 9:24. He opens his eyes, he knows what's going on. Then you have the pronouncement. Of course, pronouncement is made by God in Genesis chapter 3, 14 through 20, because God had been wronged. If Noah was wronged here in the situation, Noah is the one that makes the pronouncement in Genesis chapter 9, verses 25 through 27. And so it's just interesting when you lay this over and you see the relationship here between Genesis 1 through 3 and the parallels with Genesis chapter 6 through 9. And so, any questions or comments on anything on this slide and the parallels between the two?
Did you see the news today about the space thing that went 1 billion miles away from the Earth and you see it on another planet? And I noticed one of the reporters said, you know, our world is thousands and thousands of years old. And I'm afraid he's going to say, whatever it is about, we descended the race and all that. But it was really interesting the way they were just clear to the point, you know, that we can't know how old the earth is.
Yeah. Yeah. They were probably meaning billions and billions. Yeah. But it is interesting. No, I haven't heard that. I did hear the other day that we do have the furthest images in space we've ever had, probably from the same telescope or satellite that we sit out in space. But I haven't seen any of the images or anything like that. But it is interesting when you think about that, how massive the universe is, and that God spoke all that into existence. And so it does make you feel quite small and insignificant. But at the same time, it makes you feel big because the God that made all that cares about us on an individual level, which is pretty humbling but also exalting at the same time. And so it is interesting.
And on that satellite, they shared a record that one of the people had written, and it was singing, you know, we will conquer the world and stuff like that.
Oh, really?
And it was orbiting that place, and you could hear it playing. It's just unbelievable what technology our kids will see in the future.
It is true. Speaking about technology, let's go and let's first talk about the descendants first. In Genesis chapter 10, we have the descendants of Noah. There are 70 names that are mentioned. Now, of course, this is symbolic in the ancient world. 70 means complete. There are the 70 sons of descendants of Jacob in Exodus 1. There are the 70 elders of Israel in Genesis 24. The 70 disciples sent out in Luke 10, maybe 72. There's a textual variant there. But even outside the Bible, in the ancient Near East, 70 was used as a complete number. You have the Asherah, the Canaanite goddess, and her 70 sons. And then you have this dispersion, where the sons migrate in different directions. And you can read that in Genesis 10. We won't take the time to do that, about these things. One of the interesting things that takes place here is Nimrod. Who is Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10? We won't talk about that because it's not important, but many of you have heard of Hammurabi's Code. There is an article that was written that I can share with you talking about the Assyrian language, the Hebrew language, and the idea that the title of Hammurabi was probably Nimrod. And so maybe you have a reference to Hammurabi. Many times atheists will try to say that, Moses tried to copy his laws and statutes from Hammurabi. And so that potentially may have been Nimrod in Genesis 10, which is just an interesting part of history. The next thing is, what about Asia, America, etc.? And so we talk about the disbursement between the sons, and we don't talk about Asia. We don't talk about America. Well, that's not what the text is trying to do. The text is trying to show Israel the relationship that it has with the other nations in the ancient Near East, the tribes, the nations around them, and what's their relationship to them. And that's why you don't have any mention about Asia or America or etc., because it's not central to the story. Here's a map that you can see potentially reading into what the Bible says about the migration patterns. There you have Ham that migrates around the Mediterranean Sea on the south side. You have Shem, which kind of takes over the Arabian Peninsula right there. Shem is going to be the son that the Israelites come from. And then you have Japheth, who goes to the north and extends out to the east and the west. And so this is just a map depicting what that would have looked like in the early days of the dispersion. And so then we get to the Tower of Babel. And if you don't mind, let's read verses 1 through 9 of chapter 11. Verses 1 through 9 of chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had a brick of stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, there are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from over the face of all the earth, and they left off the building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the whole earth. And so here we have this great eastward migration. Adam and Eve went east from the garden, Genesis 3:24. Cain was sent out to the east, chapter 4, verse 16, after he was made an outlaw. And now we have, after the flood, people are continuing this migration towards the east. Shinar is what we would call today as Sumer, or the Sumerian civilization. And so this would have been close to where modern-day Babylon. In fact, many people think that Babel, of course, is the precursor to the ancient city of Babylon. You have the tower, which is a ziggurat. Oftentimes you'll see in depictions, children's storybooks, you have this spiral, like staircase-like tower going to the heavens. This is probably certainly not what the Tower of Babel would have looked like. It would have been a ziggurat that you can still go and see in the land of ancient Sumer, which is over towards modern-day Iraq. And so ziggurats were supposed to be a stairway to the gods. They look a little bit like pyramids, but they're not. I'll show you a picture of one here in just a second. In fact, I'll show it to you now. This is where it would have been. Of course, you can kind of see here, this is where the Sumerian civilization would have been. This is where Shinar would have been, this little pink section right here you can see in the modern Near East. And so this would have been what the ziggurat would have looked like. In fact, it was probably more crude than this. This is the great ziggurat of Ur, which you can still go and see the ruins of even today. And so this structure, this is solid. There is no inside. And the main idea of a ziggurat is the stairs, trying to get up to the top. You would have these stairs going up to the top. At the very top, you would have a small building. And the small building would have been a table and a bed. This was for the gods. The idea was that you build this tower up to the gods. They would have built the temple beside the ziggurat. And the idea was that the god comes down, takes of the food, he rests himself, he walks down the staircase, and then you can have God in your presence because you have built this ziggurat to the, and this was called, with his head in the heavens. Now you would see a ziggurat today and say, man, this thing's massive, but you wouldn't say his head is in the heavens. Well, our skyscrapers don't scrape the sky either, but it's an idiom. It's an idiomatic expression. And so it's not a temple, but the temple is beside them. We've uncovered about 30 ziggurats there in the ancient Near East. There are more that we have reference to, but we have uncovered about 30. And so it's interesting because the people built a tower up to the heavens. And like I said before, in ancient Near Eastern texts, a ziggurat was made. Why? For what purpose? God's come down. What happens in Genesis chapter 11? God comes down. Right, and so it's interesting that this takes place. And so the problem here is the idea of the anthropomorphic depiction of God. The idea that God doesn't need a ziggurat to come down to earth. Right? He doesn't need a house on top of the ziggurat to refresh himself with food and to rest and finish the rest of the way down the stairs. And so you can already see that man is starting to have this Anthropomorphic, which means man-like, right? Man-like characteristics and depictions of what God is. And so what you see here after the flood is paganism starting to rise. And so paganism is the idea of degrading God to having the characteristics of man. Right? There has to be more than one for them to fulfill all the functions of the world, of the universe. The idea they're capricious, that you can manipulate them with sacrifices or with well wishes, that you can patronize them, and so with a temple or some sort of idol. And so they're already showing the idea they're moving further and further away from God, and so God confuses their language. And so any questions here on this, Brother Ricky?
The concern about God was not the height of this tower and the ability of a man at that point in time?
No, I don't think so. Because even the highest ziggurats we have today are nothing in comparison to what we could do with modern technology, what we have with modern technology. And so I don't think that's the issue. Is that oftentimes there's this idea that medieval Jewish rabbis pick up on this, the idea that they were building this ziggurat so they could storm the heavens and that they could go up to God. And I don't think that's what is being said in this passage, although that's the way it's been read for a long time. But the idea of God told them to disperse. He told them to multiply the earth. They said, let's build this massive tower for ourselves. Maybe part of it was their own arrogance and this idea of so we cannot be dispersed. Right? God says, go fulfill the earth. And they say, we're going to build this tower. We're all going to get right here. And we're going to, and you can already start to see the society is starting to break down once again, just like it did pre-flood. And so God changed their languages and disperses them from Babel, if you will. Great question, though. Great question. And so any other questions on chapter 11? And so as I said before, yes.
Peleg and the earth being divided, what you're thinking about that? That maybe Peleg that's what the dividing as far as the languages happen?
Yeah. Yeah, There's a question here about whether or not this is talking about the languages or Pangea. And so the idea of the division. Now, I think this is probably talking about the division of the languages, because oftentimes in the Bible, we kind of have a blanket statement and then it zooms in. And so we see this take place throughout the Old Testament. Just like we saw in the Judges, we're in the Judges. Oftentimes it would give us a snapshot. The Midians ruled over Israel for X amount of years. And then it would focus in and tell us about the judge, which in this case would be Gideon, who helped overthrow the Midianites. And so it kind of gives us the title and then focuses in. So I think this is probably talking about the division of languages, because here it zooms in immediately afterwards, after verse 32, I believe, the last verse in chapter 10, and then talks about the Tower of Babel and the division of the languages. That's my surmise. But there was some that would take this Pangea. Brother Ricky.
I was curious on chapter 10, verse 8, why it notes that Nimrod was the first on earth to be a mighty man. It's also noted in 1 Chronicles chapter 1.
Yeah.
What did it mean by that? I mean, was he the first trained soldier, so to speak, a warrior, or was he just a very strong man, or?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no spots in Scripture, and I'm just curious why that would be the case.
Yeah. The idea here is probably, there's no mention of a king before the flood. And so there are men who make cities for themselves. But if you even just somebody who's a history scholar who doesn't have any biblical knowledge whatsoever, if you'd say who's really the first great, ancient Near Eastern king or ruler, they'd probably say Hammurabi. And so, if you think this is talking about Hammurabi, it kind of lends itself to that. He's kind of the first superpower king, if you will. The United States, was the first superpower in our modern world. And so the kingdom that Hammurabi ruled over was really the first civilization, the first superpower in the ancient world. And so this may be who he's talking about. Because the idea is, because it's mentioned twice in Scripture, more than likely the people who were reading Genesis knew who Nimrod was. The idea that he's mentioned both times. And so Hammurabi would have been a popular enough figure where the people would have known about him in the ancient Near East, about who he was. Good question. Once again, we're not for certain, but that's probably the best guess that we have. Okay. Once we go through the rest of chapter 11, we're going to be talking about the offspring of of Shem, and the genealogy list of Shem, if it's complete. Now, if this is complete, Shem lived about, I'll tell you what, let's just say that for next week. We'll talk about Abraham, we'll talk about Shem, and so it's about time to go. So some takeaways. Number one, the awesome power of God. If we think that we can manipulate God because of the pews that we fill, because of the prayers that we pray, the songs that we sing, the acts that we do, then we are basically the modern equivalent of 21st century pagans. And so it's important for us to realize that God is God and we are not. And that just because that we give of our money, just because we give of our time, that we don't get to get mad at God when things don't go our way. Oftentimes when people have loved ones that die or things go their way, we like to say, Lord, I do all this stuff. Like I'm a Christian, I go to church, I do this, do that. Why is this happening to me? Well, we're showing that we're probably no better than those in Babel in the millennia ago, because we think that we can dictate what God does based upon what we do. At the heart of this core, that's paganism, the idea that you can manipulate God of doing what you want to do or to benefit you. We've got to remember that God is awesome and He's God. Sin destroys, parallels Genesis 1:3 and Genesis 6:9, and also, once again, the dangers of modern-day paganism. If there's no other announcements, we'll go ahead and we'll close in a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day and for all the many blessings you've given us. We're so thankful for the opportunity we have to come together and study your word. Please help us to take comfort in knowing of your awesome power and might and the fact that you hung the heavens, that you caused a flood to cleanse the earth, and that you also gave a covenant that you would not destroy the earth again, but that you also gave a covenant to Abram, and that through his seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And of course we know that's Christ Jesus. And we're so thankful for the salvation that we have in Him. Help us to remember, Heavenly Father, that the acts that we commit to you, our acts of love and worship, are not to manipulate you to doing what we would have you to do, but that we are showing our love and gratitude for you and for all the things that you have already done for us through Jesus Christ. And dear Heavenly Father, please help us to take that good news and that gospel and share it with others around us, that they too might know what it means to have a covenantal relationship with you through your Son. It's in His name we pray. Amen.